Recently, tariffs went into effect on certain goods imported into the United States from Canada, Mexico, and China. President Trump signed the executive order for these tariffs to include 25% for Canada and Mexico and 10% for goods imported from China. However, energy from Canada would be tariffed at 10%. In response, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau retaliated with a 25% tariff on certain U.S. products imported and sold in Canada. So why did President Trump start what appears to be a trade war with some of our closest geographical allies? The executive order cited a national emergency, quote, due to the extraordinary threat posed by illegal aliens and drugs, including deadly fentanyl. Now, it's no secret, China is the primary producer of fentanyl in the world, which then makes its way to Mexico and eventually into the United States by the way of the cartels. Mexico has also been reluctant to aid the U.S. on illegal immigration, specifically by their lack of enforcement against the cartels. So where does Canada come into this equation? For some time, Canada has imported drugs like fentanyl, but more recently has evolved into a producer of fentanyl. Additionally, hard drugs like fentanyl, cocaine, and heroin were decriminalized in the province of British Columbia in 2023. Perhaps even more detrimental to the United States, Canada has an incredibly lax immigration system. In fact, in 2021, they implemented a new aggressive plan to bring in 500,000 immigrants per year. They say now this is to combat a decline in birth rate and to boost their economy. To put these numbers into perspective, Canada's population is only 40 million, roughly the same size as California. Canada's immigration policy is to effectively import 1.25% of their population each and every year. What it has resulted in is immigrants using Canada as a staging area to then enter the U.S. illegally. A large portion of these immigrants are coming from Muslim-majority nations. The facts also indicate an illegal immigrant terrorist is nearly 10 times more likely to cross the Canadian border into the U.S. than cross the Mexican border into the U.S. 358 suspects on the terror watch list were arrested on the Canadian border in fiscal year 2024. By comparison, the Mexico-U.S. border saw only 155 suspects arrested. Border czar Tom Homan was absolutely right when he said you're 10 times more likely to encounter a terrorist crossing the Canadian border than the Mexican border. In September of 2024, a Pakistani student hatched a terror plot to cross the border illegally from Canada to conduct a Jewish massacre in New York. Now, thankfully, the plot was thwarted. The Pakistani student was in Canada on a Canadian visa. So it seems Canada's disastrous immigration plan is coming home to roost in the United States. While Prime Minister Trudeau has refused to address these issues to appease President Trump, he's now gone even further by implementing a tariff on American goods imported into Canada. Trump's tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China will likely result in increased costs on certain items for Americans unless they decide to no longer purchase items from these countries. Cars, car parts, fruits, vegetables, meat, and poultry are primarily what the U.S. imports from Mexico. Numerous items come from China, but specifically electronics and machinery make up a large portion of imports. From Canada, the U.S. imports are made up of vehicles and machinery mostly, but the largest and likely most impactful of all is crude oil. President Trump has levied a smaller tariff of 10% on Canadian energy products, including crude oil. The U.S. imported $97 billion worth of oil and gas from Canada just last year. Experts believe that due to supply and demand, if the tariffs stay in place, U.S. consumers wouldn't likely notice an increase in gas prices until the summer of 2025. Now, you may be wondering, why is the U.S. getting oil from Canada in the first place? It's true that the U.S. is now the world's largest oil producer thanks to fracking. Fracking produces a much lighter and easier to refine oil known as shale oil. What comes out of the ground in Canada is known as heavy oil. Because historically the U.S. was an oil importer from countries that largely produce heavy oil, Most of the refineries in the U.S. are heavy oil refineries. Basically, the U.S. is not set up to refine the vast majority of shale oil extracted from right here at home. However, easier transportation to the refineries would solve a lot of problems. Pipelines are essential in this operation. Pipelines that Biden shut down and Trump has resurrected. So while U.S. consumers are likely to eventually see some increased prices for these particular imports, the most catastrophic impact will be felt in Canada. According to U.S. government data, only 17% of all U.S. imports go to Canada, but more than 75% of Canada's exports go to the U.S. These tariffs have the leverage to cripple the Canadian economy in a country that's already heavily taxed at an average rate of around 45% of household income. To add insult to injury, several Canadian companies have already announced plans to move to the U.S. This will further hurt the Canadian economy and serve to only boost that of the United States. Canada's also found itself in a state of instability after the country's rejection of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau resulted in his resignation. Ultimately, the government is in a state of hiatus until Trudeau's replacement can be named. This is a critical moment for Canada, and President Trump knows it. There's no doubt Canada needs the United States more than the other way around. To bring everything full circle, remember, this is all due to Trudeau's resistance to Trump's request to help with border security. It seems Trudeau is willing to drive Canada's economy over the cliff, all in the name of protecting illegal immigration. I'm Ike Wingate, and this has been the Ike Report.